Hey there, welcome to the next episode of the Personal Branding for Professionals video podcast. As a part of the series, we spotlight powerful personal brands across the globe to inspire today's professionals. I'm your host, Ketaki Vaidya, and today's video is dedicated to all the women in tech. As women in tech, we face a lot of struggles. One of those, probably the biggest, is the self-doubt. No matter what happens in our workplace, we are the first ones to blame ourselves for anything. And a lot of times it's also about speaking up. Even when we do good work, even when we know that we've given our best to a particular project or to the task at hand, we are hesitant to speak up and be vocal about our accomplishments. There are things like these and many more which sometimes govern the way we look at our career and can be barriers to our career growth. In today's video, we will talk about all these struggles and we'll talk about the strategies that we can use to navigate through these struggles and still find yourself in your career in every phase of your life. So then comes the question, how do you brand yourself as a woman in tech? That's essentially what we will be discussing today. Joining us is Alana Karen. She is an award-winning tech leader, author, and speaker whose work impacts many of our everyday lives. From Google search to ads to Google grants and beyond, Alana has been leading the charge to develop, scale, build, and drive team and product development that has seen rippling industry impact. Alana's book titled Adventures of Women in Tech, How We Got Here and Why We Stay, takes a closer look at the lives of women forging their careers in tech. Before we meet Alana, I have a very exciting announcement for all of you. Today, you have a chance to win a free Kindle edition of Alana's book, Adventures of Women in Tech, How We Got Here and Why We Stay. So all you have to do to win this book is to subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments below what is that one thing from this video that inspired you the most. And Alana will pick one lucky winner to get this Kindle edition. Are you ready to begin? Let's go. Hey Alana, welcome to the show.
Hi.
So Alana, first of all, tell us about your journey, what brought you here and what shaped you into being the person that you are today?
Oh, that's a big question. I was in college and I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I've never really had a career goal or aspiration. And so I was taking history classes and creative writing and French and just figuring myself out. And I stumbled upon what was then just starting out in terms of web design. And I self-taught myself HTML and a little bit of JavaScript. And that's what led me down a career in tech. I got my first jobs my first jobs were sort of internships. And I would redo their websites, even if that wasn't what the internship was for. And then I would parlay that into more experience. And so ultimately my first job was as a webmaster, which is kind of this old-fashioned run a website term. And then my next job was at a startup in San Francisco Bay Area. And then I joined Google and I've had 4 different jobs there. And along the way, I figured out that I'm very operations focused. So all of my jobs tend to be in the how you get things done area, whether it's customer service or how you install a product or currently program management, working with engineers. And I'm very people focused. So when I go into the job, what really intrigues me is how do you motivate people? How do you hire great people? How do you keep them happy and motivated to do their jobs? And that piece of it, figuring out what made me tick, that I'm a people focused leader and I like operations. I think it took some time.
Yeah.
But it took some time, but now it helps guide my journey. And yeah, I don't know if that answered your question fully, but that's
Yeah.
that's basically a little bit of my background.
So tell me one thing, Alana, that you were a part of Google when it wasn't the big giant that we know it as. So how does it feel to be a part of that transformation? Because you must have had a lot of opportunities to start from scratch at your company. So how does it feel to be a part of the transformation, and what were some of the challenges that you faced along the way?
Yeah, I mean, when I joined, there were about 300 people. So it was a smaller company for sure.
Right.
It was already moving really fast. It was already an environment where you had to be smart and fast and be willing to sort of debate ideas. There was already a culture of, I don't know, sort of data, interest in data and intellectual rigor. And so a lot of that has stayed the same and hasn't really changed even as we've gotten bigger. And really, as we've gotten bigger, what I've had to learn is a lot more about how you navigate. You know, back then you had to like convince 2 people. Now, what if you have to convince 100? Like, how do you navigate larger groups of people and having a lot more stakeholders and getting them on board? And to some degree, just even like the red tape of a company, right? Like, what are the approvals I need to do X or Y, and what's the right way to do this? Whereas at a startup, frankly, a lot of the times nobody knows how to do anything. So it's more just like you going and figuring it out.
Yeah.
And that can be worrisome. But on the other hand, there aren't a lot of rules. As you get bigger, there's more rules, there's more ways to do things. And a lot of people don't like that feeling. I don't mind that feeling so much. It's just more work. It's more tax, if you will. So I think there's been a lot of it, but the overall kind of seeds of the culture have remained the same. And I've enjoyed watching that evolve, but stay sort of the same as the company's gotten bigger. And have that sort of expertise in that. You know, now newbies come to me and they're like, how do things work here? And I do like that feeling of sort of knowing, because I've been around a little bit more about how things work.
Right. And as a woman in tech, what are the biggest struggles that you've faced till today in your day-to-day life?
I think the biggest struggles I faced were somewhat internal, honestly. Because we come in and we don't realize it, but we've been conditioned by school or our parents or whatnot to behave a certain way.
Exactly.
And often with women, it's been in some version of behaving. Not that they think that they're putting us in a box, but they've rewarded us all along the way for being a good student and behaving and being quiet and studious and all of these things. And then you get to this environment where you're somehow supposed to speak up and you're supposed to debate your ideas, but you're supposed to do it in the right way and not the wrong way. And the right way feels like a trap because often the right way then goes against how people expect you to behave as a woman. And then you get told you're being too whatever, you're being too aggressive or whatever it is. And so there's a little bit of a dance that happens there. And I think I honestly see it on the quiet side. I used humor a lot to help kind of break the ice and remain likable while speaking up my ideas. But I think I stayed sort of internal to myself, not asking for opportunity, not telling people what I wanted. And really relying on my good work to lead the way. And it worked, but I probably stayed in that mode for too long. What I say is the trap, right? Like there was a point where I should have started to self-market more. I should have sort of been a bit more assertive about saying what was going on or saying what I wanted or what issues were. And I didn't. And it kind of took me years to get to that. So I think that's kind of a trap and something to kind of sort through. Like, what are these expectations of being likable? How much do you want to be liked? How much, can you speak up, how can you speak up, like all of those kinds of things. I think I felt overall supported at an environment like Google, but there were these invisible things. And I think some of those things, if I'd specifically looked for mentorship or spoke about it more, would have helped me. I didn't have a lot of like the super aggressive bad stories that you hear, being the only woman, all of that type of stuff. I had that later in my career, but not as much when I was forming. It was more this kind of silent stuff that I didn't know what to do. And I hadn't grown up like having to address most of that. And I didn't know how to do it.
Yeah, and you make a great point over there that as women, we often struggle to project our accomplishments. So we think that if we are doing good work and if we are being sincere at our work will speak for itself. And that's one mistake that becomes that can eventually harm you in the corporate world, because in the end, in the corporate world, everyone expects you to speak up, everyone expects you to build your brand and speak for yourself. We look at our accomplishments and we feel that if I'm going to talk about them, it might be viewed as bragging, or if I'm going to talk about them, it might be viewed as me being superior to someone else, and we don't want that. So a lot of us, we hesitate to project our accomplishment.
And I will add, it worked in school, so we've been taught that that works. It's just it doesn't work as much in the corporate environment. And then when we at first realize that, we might try speaking up and then people don't like it. Right. However we did it. And so then we keep getting reinforced to not do it. So sorry, what was your next question going to be? I bet you were going to ask me more.
Right. I was just asking you that how do you think we can project our accomplishments today as women? What strategies can we use to project our accomplishments in such a way that we are comfortable with it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I hadn't mentioned this, but I wrote a whole book on this, right? The Adventures of Women in Tech, how we got here and why we stay. And so a bunch of the examples that I use are going to be talked about more in the book. And there's going to be stories from the 80 plus women I interviewed about how they navigated this and what they tried. I will say it really does depend on the culture you're in and you as a person, what your personality works, what works for you. I mentioned that for me, I use humor a lot. And for me, that's really natural, but you might not find it to be so. So, an example where, if a guy talks over me in a meeting or re-explains what I was saying, I'll be like, oh, thanks. Thanks for re-explaining my point. Like, I guess I wasn't being clear, huh? Like, I can do that and not sound angry or bitter or whatever. And so you'll have to test out your style, but some of the common tools people use, and we talk about in the book, and it's actually sort of studied, and there's things like that can help guide you. But one of the really common things that works is to make it about the we, because women are societally, in most societies, expected to caretake. We have raised the children, we take care of the groups, we take care of the teams. And so one of the ways that women have learned to, whether it's market or raise difficult topics or whatever it is to make it about the we, right? Like, I'm raising this on behalf of others. If I don't bring this up, more junior women can't. I want a raise. And by the way, I'm in here not just for me, but for all the women who are, perhaps getting underpaid compared to their peers, right? Like, so there's a we element that helps play into that societal expectation. And to some degree, we're sort of like messing with the coding, right? We're hacking the code that already exists. The code that's already there says women are expected to behave a certain way. So how can you play into that? I'm raising my hand in this room on behalf of people who can't. When I give you feedback that you're speaking over people, it's on behalf of people who aren't as brave as me, and who won't tell you, right? And so first of all, the we can help with that societal expectation. but often it helps us get over our own hangups, right? Like if we're worried about that we're going in alone, that we look like that this is, for me, I have a huge humble value. So if it's really hard for me to just straight out compliment myself, but I can say, hey, I led this team and this team did great things quite easily because I like to recognize my team. And so, figuring out some of your own hangups at the same time and what helps you get over those can really help. For me, the we really helps a lot. People test out too what tone works, right? Of course, you would love to not have to think about this. Yeah. You'd love to just be able to go in and speak however you speak. But people do sort of test out what works best with the group that they're in. Is being sort of really assertive and quick to the point work best? Like, they try it out in a meeting in some small way first. Is sort of being delicate and suggesting a little bit of a better thing, right? Like, so they'll play around with what works better with their group, with their boss, whatnot. And they'll kind of just take really safe to fail tests, right? Like just little, like, I'm not going to go in and argue for the raise first. I'm going to argue that we should alter this meeting, right? Like, just this meeting isn't very effective, right? And they're going to start small and work from there. So I have 3 kids, everyone, if you can't tell, and they're all deciding to talk. And then a third way is that people will get others involved. So they'll do a little bit of behind the scenes work before, for instance, the meeting, so that they'll have other people who are supporters at the meeting. Yeah. And men and women use this. By the way, none of this is gender specific. It's just women may feel like they have to do it more to get over some of these hurdles. And so they might sort of like pre-campaign or have like, hey, I'm going to raise this idea in the meeting. Could you +1 it? And so another thing is just not go in alone, right? Like to not be the only person and to have fast followers. Now, if you're in a really tough culture and it's really not working, some people will even have another person raise the idea for them. I think that's fine, but I would also ask yourself, well, how long are you going to put up with that? Right? Like if you're in that culture and it's really not working, what are you going to try? And then if it doesn't work, maybe it's time to find a different team or a different boss or whatever it is, if that's really the way it is. But yeah, there are things that you can do that kind of maneuver and sort of thinking about it a little bit, like what is the system that you're part of and what are you testing to move it?
Yeah, those are some very interesting strategies, but I think the bigger struggle over here is to first realize that you yourself are being your biggest hurdle along the way, because not a lot of times we don't realize, but we, because of the way that we've been brought up or the way that the society expects us to behave, we don't realize that we are harming ourselves by not thinking about what we want, or we are not speaking up enough. And to first realize that and then try these mechanisms, that's equally important. But even then, there are people who can discourage you. There are people who will try to put you down. So how would you suggest that we handle such people? Because there are such stories, there are such experiences that people have had. So how do you handle those struggles without creating an awkward situation at workplace or without ruining your relationship with that person?
Yeah, absolutely. I call them the toughies, just for shorthand. Yeah. And I think that there's interesting things you have to think about when you're dealing with difficult people. And some of it is like, could you get to know them a little bit better, right? Like outside of the work. And I don't mean like you don't have to go anywhere with them, but just like, could you have a one-on-one meeting where you're just generally chatting and you're getting to understand kind of what are their opinions and motivations and whatnot? Because for a large percentage of them, they might be caustic in a certain atmosphere, or they might give difficult feedback in a certain atmosphere, but then they might be totally different in another atmosphere. So you may be able, through taking them out of that environment, you might be able to make some progress and get to the other side with them. And that will work for a chunk of them. I think just trying to get to know them, get their motivation, be like, hey, that happened in that meeting and I'm curious what we could do to better talk, or like you gave me this feedback and I want to understand it more. And usually more dialogue and maybe a different environment kind of helps break it down. But then there's going to be some that are just really tough.
True.
And that doesn't work with, or in fact, the experience that you initially had was so horrible, you don't want to even do that with, right? Like you don't want to be alone with them. You don't want to, whatever it is. So I would say for ones where the behavior was rough, but generally acceptable, right? Like maybe it hurt your feelings. You didn't like the feedback, but it wasn't like HR, report to HR sensitive. For the set that are kind of still in the realm of the acceptable, okay, so just, do you have to deal with that person ever again? Can you avoid them, right? I think especially if you got feedback from them, before you internalize it and decide that it was true, can you gut check it with a few other people?
Yeah.
Right? Because sometimes, maybe it was true. Maybe there was a version of truth in there and it was just delivered not well. Maybe it was just a one-off and the guy or the girl was in a bad mood and you should just throw that out. But I've seen plenty of people sort of internalize that and then take it with them in their career without ever vetting it, right? Vet it with some other people. Like, hey, you were in the room and I thought that was a little harsh. What did you think? Am I just being super sensitive? Whatever it is, try to get a little bit of a set of that. But you also, there's been at least, even in a great company like Google, there's been people that I've just been like, okay, well, I'm going to avoid you. Like, if I don't need to work with you, I'm not going to work with you. Like, you're not that pleasant. I don't need to seek you out. Like, can I navigate this a different way? So also don't feel like you have to keep throwing yourself. We don't need to be liked by everyone. We don't need to get approval from everyone. Now, if they are in a position of power and there's no way to avoid them, that is a good place where I would try the first tactic, which is, can you reach some kind of détente with them? Can you figure out a way that they tick? And can you just play purely to that aspect of them? And hopefully that works for you. But if in the end, if you're kind of trapped in an organization and that person is the boss of the organization and you can't avoid them, then again, I would say, what are the few things you're going to try? What's the time frame you're going to try it for? And if that doesn't work, could you move, right? Yeah. Again, I think another thing is we stay a long time thinking it's us. Well, guess what? If you've tried what you can try and you've done what you can do, it's probably not you, right? Or maybe it's you, maybe it's just a bad fit, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean you should keep knocking your head against the wall. Now, it also doesn't mean you have to leave the next day and be out of work, right? Take your time, make a move to something that you want to do. But just know that if after 6 months you've tried some things and it's not working, that then you will start to look, or whatever it is that kind of helps you stay in control. Because it's in these moments where, you don't really want to lose control. And then the last thing is, if the person was really over the line, HR, you felt like it was a hostile workplace or whatever it was, then again, I would say you have to sort of decide at that point, do you want to talk it over with others? Do you want to talk it with HR? But I wouldn't internalize it as you did something that was your fault. Again, you're in the driver's seat. What do you do with that feedback? What do you do within the organization you're in? And, you move forward accordingly. And that's hard to say because, of course, companies are different, countries are different, but there's going to be processes for all of that.
Yeah. And all these strategies, they are absolutely true. And one thing that we commonly struggle with is to find our own way of dealing with things. And if we, as soon as we hear something negative, we internalize it thinking that it was us and we are the first ones to find fault in ourselves. And that is something, I don't know if we are coded to be that way, but it's very easy to fall into that trap and think that it was my mistake, or it is because of me, maybe I'm not the perfect person for this organization, and we start getting into that negative zone and we let that get to ourselves. So one thing,
Yeah.
especially in the 3 years of my career, I've found, which is the biggest struggle, is to let things go, because I start overthinking about that same conflict again and again and again till it has affected me completely. And then I start finding fault in myself to justify that situation, to justify that that person was correct. So this is something that we should try and avoid, which is not easy, and it still takes your own time to be comfortable with it and to reach a point where you have a shield around yourself where these things don't affect you. So how
Yeah,
would
yeah,
you
yeah.
suggest that we build that shield?
Yeah, and I talk about it in the book, which is that one of the things that I saw in common was a tool women had used over time was just this concept of resilience. And we're talking about it more and more now in the workplace. Like, how do we have grit? How do we have resilience, thick skin, whatever it is?
Yeah.
And I talk about it as a muscle that we build over time, right? How do we get back up when we've been knocked down?
Yeah.
How do we continue on when there are challenges? And how do we, in fact, use those challenges as food to get even better?
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think that it certainly is something, it can take time. And I think that some of us along the way can honestly get tired and bitter of doing it. And so it's also important that along the way you're figuring out, how do you nurture yourself? How do you take time for yourself? If all you're doing all the time is for other people, is for the company that you work with or work for, you will burn out. And the people I saw who over time, and often in our 20s, that's kind of the mode we're in.
Yeah.
But over time, they had to figure out, well, what does it mean for me? Like, what's my hobby, or what's my balance? What's my thing that I do, especially as we start to have children. And that means that we might have less time for ourselves if we do that. So there's definitely some journeying through all of this that you do within yourself.
Yeah.
At the same time as we're having this like career and we're picturing just going up the ladder or whatever it is. There's all this stuff you are figuring about yourself and building up for yourself that helps you get through all of this.
That's true. And how do you think that as women, we should brand ourselves at work to elevate our credibility? What are the strategies that we can use to do that and excel at our job every day?
Yeah, I think, I to some degree, my answer, I think, is, I don't know, maybe it's like an old-fashioned answer. But I've seen it work for lots of people. So I still kind of think it's an old but true answer, which is that the people that I've seen succeed really well, focused first in coming into their job and their environment and building up knowledge and relationships and really doing that to the benefit of their core job. So their first focus was to come in and do an absolutely amazing job at whatever their core job was.
Right.
And that catapults them initially into, better opportunity, better pay, promotions, whatever. That pays off. And as they've done that, because they've amassed knowledge and relationships, they're often in the right place, the right time.
Yeah.
They're coming up with new ideas because they can make those connections. And that then starts to get them viewed as a leader. And either from sort of a specialist perspective, where they become more and more the expert in some knowledge domain, or for people. Right. And I would say, some people go down the people management path because it seems like the way up. I personally would only do it if you really like managing people. It's a lot of work and often thankless. So you really got to love managing and nurturing people and their growth. But I totally understand if you got into it mostly because it was the only way up in your company. But once you're in that position, really thinking about then what kind of leader are you and what makes you tick and what do you care about and how do you lead your group? Because that then ends up being a lot of your brand is, you know, initially you might have sort of like the expert, great individual contributor brand, or she really knows her stuff in X or Y. But once you start to be a leader, you know, kind of really figuring out like, oh, you know, she's a data focused, you know, you go to her if you really want to like learn your chops in data. Right? Like, what is it? What is the brand or like, what is the stuff? And I would use your passions, like your true interests as a guide to your brand. So for example, I love people. I've been very clear that I'm a people focused leader. It's on my LinkedIn. You know, I talk about it publicly. It's what makes me tick. You can show me charts and graphs at work and I understand them. They just don't interest me that much. Like I've seen a lot of charts and graphs, like all essentially look sort of similar to me. Whereas you show me like a person with like a problem and I'm very, very interested in like how you help them get over that hurdle and feel motivated to do their job. So use your passions as that guide and talk about them, right? I think the final thing is, you know, do them, then walk the walk, right? Like once you've figured out what those things are, mentor people in this stuff, do talks on it, right? Share with your boss that you're interested in those things, offer help out on projects on those things, but create this identity for yourself if that's what you love.
Yeah, branding is about your internal story as well. It's about what story you have to share and what makes you different from everyone else. So Alana, tell us about your book. What was there a specific incident that motivated you to write this, or was this in your plan since long?
I guess a little bit of both. I think I've always liked writing, and I think I've probably been sort of collecting stories in my own life, maybe even unconsciously for a while. But a couple of years ago, I was thinking about what do I want to do next? And it wasn't necessarily that I thought I would leave Google, but I was sort of thinking about, well, what's the next phase in my career? And I had spent a lot of time over the years very focused on my job, very focused on Google. And it was the first time that I thought, oh, I think I want to do something outside, like I think a little bit broader. I'm going to start by writing more and I'm going to publish those articles. And so I published an article series on LinkedIn, leveraging my Google experience. It was in fact about the performance feedback I'd received over the years and how I developed and how that shaped my career, but very much to share with the world. And as I was doing that, I saw the feedback that I was getting, and it was all very positive, especially about the really difficult stuff. Like I was a manager and I was being given really harsh feedback about being a manager and what did I do about it? And it really made me think about how there aren't a ton of stories out there about just women in the middle, as I call them, right? Like not at the tippy top, not becoming CEOs, you know, not having terrible experiences, which I feel super bad about, but just somewhere in the middle, right? Somewhere in the middle, navigating their careers in tech. And in fact, there were starting to be more and more stories about women leaving tech. And here I was amid all of these women still in tech thinking, wait, like, but there's a whole bunch of us here. And why aren't there stories about us? If I were trying to join tech today, would I even know that these jobs exist and women do them? And and that was really the spark. And it was the beginning of 2019. And I just decided I'm going to write a book. And it was a huge passion project for me for a year and a half, and got it out later this year. And so now it's everybody can get it. Woot.
I've started reading this book, and for me, the biggest thing that is really commendable about this book is the fact that it doesn't give us some mantras to follow, but it gives us these real life experiences that we can learn from, which is a very different way to hear about these experiences, because generally we read about them and we read about the do's and don'ts, but we hardly come across the real experiences that have actually happened.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I was always very interested in all the stories. I'm a very story driven person. And I like that mix of stories and data. And so I tried to look for sort of that mixture as I was doing the book. So I do reference data along the way and studies. But the majority of the book are really the stories I got from the women and what they experienced. And I think that the major takeaways for me ended up being, I'd gone in thinking, there's just such diversity in tech already, and we're not talking about it, and that's an inclusion problem. And that ended up being really true. You'll see a lot of stories of women from very different backgrounds who never thought they would get into tech, lots of different jobs, lots of different ambitions, single parents, right? Different races, like all different backgrounds. And we need more of that. We absolutely need more of that.
Yeah.
But it was such a joy to see all the different stories and people navigating and figuring out their place in tech.
Yeah.
And I just really want to recognize that. I want to recognize the diversity that we do have and fight to retain it. And I think that often we're very focused on hiring more diversity, but then we don't focus as much on inclusion for the women or other minoritized populations that are already here. I think the second part was that there were absolutely challenges and women were figuring out how to navigate them. And if we could help women do that faster, we would likely have more women in leadership or women's influence in tech, whether they become leaders or not. Because what you see in a lot of their journeys is it took maybe the first X years of their career to really feel comfortable.
Yeah.
And then they start, then maybe they're a manager, and then they start. And so it really did, during this process of interviewing women, I started to really think, what if we could speed this up? What if we could get you comfortable 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier? What would happen then? And what would we see about women in leadership or women in positions of power in tech overall?
Yeah, and these things really need to be talked about, because more often we just see either people talking about the absolute worst place that they've been to. They only talk about the negative things. Then we see people talk only about the positive things, and then we see people who don't care, even though they've reached the top positions of their industry. As a woman, they did not care to support other women. There are women like that too. And somewhere along these lines, when we can find a book that shares all of these experiences, it is a blessing to be able to read that book and to have that entire encyclopedia of experiences at one place. So thank you so much for writing that book. And for our viewers, I really want to announce this is the first giveaway of this series, and I'm so excited about it. Tell us about what inspired you the most from this interview. Tell us about that one thing which inspired you the most, and Alana will pick one lucky winner to get a Kindle edition of that book. So Alana, I will share the entries both on LinkedIn and YouTube with you, and you can choose who gave the best answer, and hopefully I can participate too.
Of course, looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us, Alana. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and being so vocal and honest about it.
Yeah, thank you for doing this.
Hello again. I hope you like this video. I want to remind you once again that you have a chance to win a free Kindle edition of Alana's book, Adventures of Women in Tech, How We Got Here and Why We Stay. All you have to do is subscribe to this channel and comment below on what was the one thing that inspired you the most from this conversation. And you can be the next lucky winner that Alana picks to get the free Kindle edition of our book. Before saying goodbye, I want to remind all the wonderful women in tech that you know what you are made of. Don't ever forget your worth. Keep going. You should be proud of yourself, and I'm really, really proud of you. Having said that, I'll see you next Monday. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Thank you. Bye.